I want to start with something that we heard yesterday, or actually Monday, during opening statements. Counsel told us that there's always two sides to every story, and with all due respect, this is not one of those stories. This is a story that pretty clearly shows what happened. It's a story of the defendant taking a dog collar that was around her friend's neck and pulling it so hard and for so long and with such force that it caused his death. That in that moment, she made a deliberate choice to end her friend's life. She then, after the fact, degrades his body, engages in sexual acts with him. This is a story of the defendant then dismembering him and leaving his remains all over the house for his mother to find. And this isn't the state's story. This isn't law enforcement's story. It's the defendant's story, as you heard today, right? So as we go through this, it's easy to sit here and say, yes, the defendant confessed, and it's true. She confessed to every single element that you will see that the state needs to prove. But we didn't just stop there, right? We could have been done with this case on Monday, played her interview and called it a day. But you should expect more, right? We have the burden of proof, and obviously we called a number of witnesses to establish what this story shows. So I want to walk through that story. And I know there's a lot of law that was just read to you, but I'm a visual learner, so I like to see kind of what we're looking at here. So as I go through these three offenses, there's really, as you'll see, 6 things the state needs to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Not every fact that was testified to, not what time somebody got to Scott Holmes' house at the end of the night. The 6 elements are what the state needs to prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt, okay? So first, count 1, first-degree intentional homicide. First, that the defendant caused the death of Shad, and that she, second, acted with intent to kill him, okay? And again, as I already mentioned, as we go through these elements, you heard earlier this morning that the defendant is acknowledging every element that we hear, okay? Independent of the information you heard today, with the investigation you heard, the DNA, the other information, Dr. Tranquita's testimony, I would argue would prove all these elements as well. But you have on top of that the defendant's admissions to all these elements. Okay? So the defendant caused the death of Shad. I mean, that should be fairly clear here. Obviously, she admits that. You heard Dr. Tranquita's testimony of how Shad died, the cause and the manner of death, strangulation, excessive force being placed on the neck, producing his death. That was the sole cause of death that we heard. So let's talk about intent, right? Because that admittedly sometimes is a tricky topic, right? We can never know anyone's intent truly, and as you're told, you're not going into the mind of somebody, right? Kind of looking at all the facts and circumstances that you see. In this case, you have the benefit of the defendant opening up her mind to you and telling you what her intent was here. But you also have other signs, right? So what does intent mean? That somebody had the mental purpose to do something, right? Some volition. Or that they're aware that what they're doing is practically certain to cause that result, right? And you heard both, really, from the defendant. So I want to walk through that because there's a lot of points in that interview where the defendant is telling you exactly what her intent was in this case, right? His face was turning purple, right? She describes that and how he's coughing up blood, and you know that's accurate, right? Because you heard Dr. Tranquita's testimony and you saw those photographs. She's seeing that in person, and yet what does she say? I still didn't stop. No. She felt a heartbeat at one point, right? She talks about feeling his heartbeat, and she kept pulling more, and he wouldn't die. And, I just wanted him, and I was like, damn. Right? She admits even that Shad's struggling in this moment, that he's fighting back, right? You heard from Dr. Tranquita as well about how it looked like at one point there were signs of that, where the collar slipped up along the tongue. She's telling you, I was waiting for him to die. I liked it. She figured I'm already this far, and she's pantomiming the act. It's like she's starting a lawnmower. That's how hard she's pulling on this chain, right? Took 3 to 5 minutes, she thinks. And again, that's consistent with Dr. Tranquita, right? this is not an accident. This isn't a whoops. This is an intentional act, right? I don't need to prove that she went to that house with this intent, right? We talked about that in voir dire, and we kind of talked through that concept of how, as you're instructed, intent can be formed in the instant before an act, the instant before the pull of a trigger, the instant in this case before Ms. Schabusiness decides, I'm going to go further and pull on this chain so hard that it causes the result that we saw in Shad, right? So we have the mental purpose, right, from the defendant's own mouth, and that's consistent with everything else we're seeing in the case. But you also have Detective Kempf asking her, in that moment, did you kind of realize if you kept pulling on that chain that he would die? She's like, probably, yeah. Yeah, she was aware of that. Right, so that goes to this kind of the second either-or part of intent, right? Was aware that her conduct was practically certain to cause that result, and it's probably obvious as you sit here of what's going to happen when you're pulling a metal chain like that hard for that long, seeing the result of what's happening to another person, that is going to be the result, right? So you're told you can't look into a person's mind. The defendant told you exactly what her intent was in this case. But as I mentioned, you also have other indicators, right? You have Dr. Tranquita's testimony describing the amount of force that would need to have been done to cause the injuries that he's observing, right? Down to the inner neck muscles, and he was talking about how strong and thick those neck muscles are, and there was hemorrhaging that deep. That's how hard and how long and how much injury the defendant was causing. Right? This isn't an accident. If it's an accident, you're not going forward. You're not seeing this result and keep pulling. You're calling for help. You're stopping. You're certainly not after the fact, after you finally finish, then cutting up his body, right? You have all the evidence in this case points to intent, right? You have her acts after the fact, like I said. If this was an accident, something happens, right? You call for help, and you have the exact opposite. You have the defendant cutting him up and cleaning up, getting rid of the remains, pouring it down the shower. We heard a lot of testimony about that. Kind of wiping up with the Clorox wipes, which the defendant is acknowledging as well. So you have the defendant's statement in the case, and it lines up with everything else in the case, right? Even little facts that she's remembering and telling you about, right? The timeline of the February 21st night, right? We heard from A.J. Gannon. You heard the stipulated testimony from Mr. Tomes. You heard from Mike Thyrion. It's all consistent. Yeah, they were coming and going. You then heard from Steve Hendricks about, yep, they got back sometime in the early morning, and I let them in. Defendant's telling you that same thing. Steve is talking about how at one point during the day on the 22nd, she comes up and asks for her eyeglasses, and we heard the defendant talk about that as well. We heard Detective Graff testify about that. So everything she's saying is consistent with what we're objectively seeing, what law enforcement is finding. And in some respects, the defendant's leading the investigation, right? Because when they get there, when law enforcement gets there, we saw Officer Wanish's body cam. We heard from Detective Scanlon and even Dr. Tranquita about how it was really hard to determine what exactly happened when they first got there. And all that information is being provided by the defendant. Okay? So it's an intentional act. She had the mental purpose. We heard about that. It's not, as I talked about, it can be formed at any time before the act, right? It doesn't need to be premeditated. That's not the law in this state. And it's really important, too, to not confuse this with motive, right? We heard evidence about motive, right, and her interest in Jeffrey Dahmer and all that entails. But intent doesn't mean motive. This is what intent means, and we proved intent, right? She caused his death, and she acted intentionally, and she told you as much. So those are the two elements. Those are the two things the state needs to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Count two, mutilating a corpse. So again, there's two elements for this crime. First, the defendant dismembered a corpse. Second, did so with the intent to conceal a crime. So the first element, I think, is pretty clear, right? And we heard extensive testimony from many people, and we saw Dr. Tranquita's diagrams, and obviously I can't imagine this element is going to be in dispute, right? And so again, though, we have this concept of intent, the purpose to conceal a crime, right? And I mean, as you're instructed, you use your common sense. Like, why is somebody going to this length, not only cutting up a body? We heard from Dr. Tranquita about the multiple sort of start and stop kind of signs, the total evisceration of Shad, bagging him into other bags and attempting to carry out. Like, that's the intent, right? We use our common sense that's why you're doing that. But again, she was asked about this, the defendant. And remember in that February 28th interview, the second interview with Detective Groff and Detective Scanlon, she's saying exactly what her intent was, right? It was because there's other people in the house. Like, what am I going to do? Leave the body and have mom find it? She admits, again, this was her intent, and it's obvious with our common sense, but it shows that the state has proved both elements of this crime as well. Okay, count 3. It's third-degree sexual assault. So the defendant had sexual intercourse with Shad and did so without consent. So let's talk about the first part. Sexual intercourse is defined in this state as inserting any object into the genital or anal opening of another, or engaging in oral contact with the penis. We heard about both, right? The defendant admitted to both. She's talking about how she's put the dildo in Chad's anus after she killed him. She's talking about how she was sucking on his penis, and there were other phrases used to that effect. So again, we have, for both elements here, the defendant's admissions. And we heard from Mr. Scott, didn't we? We heard from Mr. Scott about the DNA testing that was done, right? And for some of the reasons why, even though the defendant's DNA is on that dildo in Shad's house, Shad's DNA wasn't found on there. And nothing excludes that possibility. And again, everything the defendant's telling you is consistent with other things you're seeing. So there's no reason to believe, a reasonable hypothesis to believe, that she's not also telling you what's happened in this case too, right, for this count. And the second element, did not consent. I mean, that, as you're instructed, is kind of inferred by the fact that at the time that the defendant's telling you she's engaging in these acts, that Shad's deceased, right? So he's not in a position to consent. Okay. So those are the 2 elements for count 3. So in total, 6 elements for the 3 offenses. And again, you're given a lot of law on how to assess credibility of witnesses, and that's good, and you should follow it. Really, you kind of just use your common sense as jurors. And again, the defendant's telling you what happened, and there's nothing in the case to disbelieve what she's saying, right? So you have the defendant's admissions, as I mentioned earlier. There's other evidence that kind of just only should bolster the conviction in the defendant's guilt, right? We heard from Kevin Scott, who heard or testified about the DNA testing he did. Shad's blood on the defendant's hands, on her clothing, on the sweatpants, about how the knives that were found had Shad's blood on them, right? Even absent her confession, I mean, there's ample evidence here to convict on all 3 counts. You have many witnesses coming in to talk about the integrity of the investigation, how law enforcement didn't just take the confession and go home, right? We do more, right? Send things in for DNA. We speak with other witnesses. We corroborate the defendant's timeline of things. You heard all that. And that's really important, right? We have the burden of proof. And we talked about that, and we embrace that burden of proof. You should hold us to that standard as the state to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's why we call people from Madison to come up to talk for 5 minutes about, yeah, I received this piece of evidence, and it was fine. And I returned that piece of evidence, and it was fine, right? Because it's important. We want to show that law enforcement did a thorough investigation in this case, and they did, because we have the burden of proof. You're instructed on what the burden of proof is and what it's not, right? It's a reasonable doubt, a reasonable hypothesis consistent with guilt, consistent with innocence. You should find the defendant not guilty. But you're not searching for doubt. You're ultimately searching for the truth. So even if it's a heavy burden, it doesn't mean the decision is difficult in cases. You are instructed not to search for doubt. You're to search for the truth. And there's not a reasonable hypothesis in this case consistent with the defendant's innocence. There just isn't, right? There's one truth in this case. There's one side of the story, and it happens to be the defendant's story as well, but it's consistent with everyone else's story. It's because that story is the truth of what the defendant did to her friend Shad. And based on that, we would ask that you return guilty verdicts on all 3 counts. Thank you.